Our next presenter, as they say, needs no introduction. It's Kevin Gill from the Master Group, one of my good friends. He's going to be speaking about A2L refrigerants. Actually, I just heard that Trump just abolished all of that. So are we going to...
Don't give away anything.
I'm sorry. So he's really going to be talking about A2L as they're being replaced by R22. So Trump, as you all are aware, very progressive. So he recognizes the value of R22 in the industry. 12. No, he's not that old. But no, anyway, all kidding aside, Kevin's going to help us out with some of the challenges with the A2L and some of the transitions with equipment and what have you. So again, Kevin Gill, everybody.
Good morning, everybody. So first and foremost, big thanks to our partners at ORAC and all the members. Appreciate you having me. What a privilege it is to see you 2 weeks in a row for some of you, because we were at the AGM a couple weekends ago. So to Dino's point, we're going to cover A2L today. We had some last-minute changes to the agenda because there was indeed a very big announcement in the United States. Anybody heard what happened last week? Okay, there's like 2 people that were paying attention to the news. So we'll walk you through that. Today we're going to put a bit of a different spin on things. We presented this last year to you with a bit more of an air conditioning and HVAC feel. We're going to go a little bit more refrigeration heavy this time, especially predicated on what's happening throughout the United States. But we're also going to get into some technical weeds. So hopefully you'll keep up, and if you have any questions, please ask as we go along. So just a quick agenda. We're going to cover that AIM Act and technology transition rule. There is an announcement from the White House on the AIM Act. It is a doozy, and it's going to be very, very heavily influential on what Canada is going to do next. Because even though we don't care much about what the United States is doing at the moment, we do very much care on what Canada's going to do, and we're likely going to follow Big Brother. Odshar, again, a little bit about, or maybe a little bit more of a reminder, I guess, on what we proposed in terms of our GWP thresholds on the index and what segments of business it'll affect. So that'll be more of a refresher. Obviously, we don't have anything outside of the proposal stage right now, but we'll talk a bit more about it. We're going to go over the landscape. So again, giving you an eagle-eye view of all the different refrigerants that are out there. A lot of people are under this illusion that we're talking about 2 gases, 454B and R32. There are dozens more out there. Granted, only about a dozen of those dozens are going to be predominant and majorly impactful on the refrigeration side of things, but it's important that you understand what they are and where they land on the scope. An often omitted discussion point, performance variables. So last year at the Spring Forum, if you remember, we actually gave some comparatives between 410, 454B, and 32. This year, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to talk about 454A, 454C, and 455A. Everybody knows what those are, right? Well, we'll go over them and we'll make sure you have a good understanding. Gone are the days of set it and forget it. Releasable charge and room area formulas. So as you know, with any 2L class gas, you can't just slap it in anymore like you would an A1, right? We have to think about, do we have the right square footage? Do we have the right safety devices? Do we have mechanical ventilation? There are a number of things that we need to talk about, and there's a formula with which to do that, and we're going to discuss it and some of the risk factors encompassed into that. Again, safety devices, what's going to be required in line, be that check valves, safety solenoids, and the like. But we're also going to talk a little bit about leak detection, where our LFL limits are, and so on. And then lastly is something very interesting, understanding UL certification. It might sound boring, but maybe this will familiarize you, or maybe sound familiar if you've experienced it. We're starting to get calls now, and the end users are the drivers of this. We're starting to get calls now saying, I don't want to replace my equipment. I just want to retrofit the 410 out of it and put the 2L in it. That's a big problem. And we're going to talk about what UL has to say about it, because that is the overseeing eye for any of the OEMs and manufacturers out there. So it's not really governed by the B52 or the B51 or the B149, even though there is some overlap. So it's important that we understand what UL is, why it's relevant, and how it impacts that decision when you're answering your customer. So, again, starting with the United States, obviously, very, very big announcement. There is a big update, but just kind of a refresher on where we were in September. So I know that may be hard to read for some of you, but in September of 25, the EPA had a proposal that came out. The announcement came out in March of last year, but then in September, they started to come out with actual steps to roll back the AIM Act under the Biden administration. And in it, it started to cover intermodal transport, but the big fish in the room was retail food, so supermarket, cold storage warehousing, and standalone units. That was a big one. And the industrial side. Now, if you look at the bottom, it's kind of hidden there. Residential and light commercial air conditioning. That is all the unitary products. That's rooftops, right? That's VRF, anything in a box. Residential. And the proposal for that one, and I'll start there, is remove the installation compliance date. That's what was going to be proposed. So if you're not familiar with the way that the US law is written, under the Biden administration and under the AIM Act 2020, as of up until last week, you could not install a 410A air conditioner. Now, we're not used to that here because we don't have any laws written on the subject at present, right? But the US did. So the proposal was to remove the compliance dates. On the cold storage warehouses, they wanted to raise the threshold to 700 GWP. Now, that doesn't really do a whole lot of good. It brings R513, R450, 454A, 454C, 455, and a couple of others as options, but it doesn't give you the 448 and 449 that we need. But on supermarkets, they had said, we want to raise that to 1,400. Well, that's a completely different discussion, because now 448 and 449 are back in the picture, right? So, and you'll see on the landscape where these refrigerants sit on a capacity, pressure, and GWP scale. But ultimately, this was the proposal. But I'm going to give you a 5-minute break of hearing me speak about it, and I'm going to let somebody else tell you exactly what happened.
It's a great honor. We have tremendous people behind me. You'll be hearing about that in a minute. Today is my honor to be discussing the taking of a very historic action to substantially lower costs for consumers, protect hundreds of thousands of jobs, and save Americans well over $2 billion a year by officially terminating the Biden administration's ridiculous regulations imposing costly requirements on refrigerators and air conditioners. It's ridiculous, unnecessary, and costly, and actually makes the machinery worse. I want to thank EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin, Senators John Husted. John, thank you. I heard you're doing very well in your race, I hear. That's what the word is. And Ashley, I know you're doing very well also. Ashley Moody, Florida, great. As well as Representatives Stephanie Bice, Zach Nunn, and Craig Goldman. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you all. You look good. We're joined by Kroger CEO. That's a big one. Kroger, that's a big, I see those stores all over the place. Greg Foran. Where's Greg? Greg? Very good. You look like Central Casting. Just like you're supposed to look. Fairway Store CEO Reynolds Kramer.
Right here, Mr. President.
Okay. Hello, Reynolds.
Hello there.
Maybe I won't look around every time. Why Not Stop CEO and co-owner Ann Gauthier. Ann?
Yeah.
Because it's Ann, I'm going to. Columbiana Foods co-owner Ron Graff Sr.
Right here. Right behind me.
Hello, Ron. Neiman Foods President Richard Neiman.
Right here, sir.
Hi, Richard. Piggy, well, that's a nice, Piggly Wiggly franchise owner. And that's a big company, too. It's actually a cute name. Kevin McDaniel. Where's Kevin? How's that name playing? Good?
Piggly Wiggly doing great.
Piggly Wiggly. I've heard that, actually. That's great. Franchise owner Kevin, so you met Kevin, and Food Fresh owner Michael Gay. Food Fresh? Hi, Michael. How are you, Michael? And this is a representative group of very large-scale retailers. Under the Biden administration, the so-called technology transition rule, which was crazy, forced companies to adopt specific high-cost refrigerants, massively driving up the price of transporting and storing refrigerants and various goods. Many grocery stores and restaurants had no choice but to replace their refrigerators entirely. They went out of business, half of them. And these costs rose. Americans faced higher grocery prices and reduced access to critical medical supplies. It was a very catastrophic thing that they did. At the same time, this rule also drove up the cost of living by forcing consumers to purchase higher cost residential air conditioning units. They went up very substantially in cost, and also they were going to be obsolete very quickly. It created national security risk by adding additional hurdles to the already complicated process of manufacturing semiconductors. So it was a mess. Likewise, the so-called emissions rule imposed crippling leak repair requirements on virtually all existing large-scale refrigeration systems, hurting consumers and small businesses, making it almost impossible for many small businesses to even buy inferior equipment. And this is all across the country. The higher cost threatened thousands of jobs and was passed on in the form of higher prices and higher taxes. Today's reforms will deliver significant financial relief, saving American families and businesses more than $2.4 billion. Think of that, each year. Thanks to today's reforms, the American people have lower grocery prices, cheaper transportation of goods, lower costs of air conditioning, at no detriment at all to our country. Zero. Including environmental detriment. My administration's historic deregulatory agenda has already saved our country an estimated $1.2 trillion. That's been done over a relatively short period of time. 1.2 trillion with a T. We're committed to fixing and really completely ending Biden's disastrous regulatory policies and delivering financial relief to each and every American, which is what we're doing. This was a tremendous burden, a tremendous cost. These people had to live with it, not only refrigerants, but a lot more. And it was making the equipment unaffordable. And the actual benefit was nothing. It just made it worse. It made life worse, and it made it worse, and it drove up costs tremendously. So now I'd like to ask Administrator Lee Zeldin, who's absolutely fantastic. He's doing an incredible job. We're proud of you, Lee. Really, the job you're doing is incredible. Followed by Greg, Kevin, and Michael. Is that okay? Lee, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. As you know, many Americans were expressing a lot of frustration and anger of this rushed, frantic, reckless sprint by the Biden administration to phase out reliable equipment for grocery stores, for restaurants, and for homes. And the consequences, well, they've been devastating. And once again, the Trump administration is answering the call, which will lower the cost of living for hardworking American families. Now look at this chart to your far right. Today's actions are saving over $2.4 billion for American families. It's safeguarding 350,000 jobs. Just in supermarkets alone, we're going to see a savings of $800 million, which Americans will be able to see when they go and buy their food. The Biden EPA face planted when trying to jam through their restrictions. Americans who wanted to be able to fix their equipment were instead being required to buy far more costly new equipment, and that just doesn't make any sense. Refrigeration trucks were being handed impossible restrictions to meet. And once again, here we are in the Oval Office. President Trump is righting another wrong. At the Trump EPA, we are proudly implementing President Trump's agenda every single day and delivering for the American people.
So seldom do we hear those trigger words, HVAC, refrigeration, supermarket, refrigerants, come out of the mouth of the President of the United States. This is a big deal, folks. Though this is in the United States, you got to appreciate we're going to follow Big Brother, as I prefaced. We don't know what Canada is about to do, but it's really important that we understand what they're doing so we can better prepare. So, all that said, this is what is going into force and effect in the United States. For supermarkets, they are delaying the 150 and 300. For those of you that remember, it was a system over 200 pounds, 150 GWP was your limit. Less than 200 pounds, 300 GWP was your limit. They have now extended that to the year 2032 and raised that threshold to 1,400 GWP. That brings our 448 and 449 back into play, right? Remote units, again, same thing. Jan 1 of 2032. Now, there is some investigation. This is about a 180-page document. There is a quick fact sheet that's about 3 pages long with these charts on it. If you're interested, you can go to epa.gov and have a look. But at the end of the day, we're still figuring out when they say cold storage warehouses, does that constitute standalone? And is this equipment-based or application-based? So that's something that everybody is trying to interpret. I've reached out to AHRI, HRAI, and a number of others that are well connected both within the United States government as well as the Canadian ministers, just to figure out what the interpretations are so we can deliver accurate information to you. And then, of course, for industrial refrigeration, again, they're extending that through to 2028 and into 2030, depending on the poundage of your system. So that is a pretty big impact to the refrigeration segment. Now you might say, well, what happened on the residential and the HVAC side for unitary systems? So what they did was they just removed the installation compliance date. So they are now permitting all of the US to install any air conditioner that, say, we'll call it a residential dealer or a commercial dealer had in their inventory, and they're permitting it for install. But they're also permitting any wholesaler or supply house or OEM who had inventory to sell through on anything that was manufactured preceding Jan 1 of 2025, because there's a stockpile of 410 units right now in the United States because the law said you can't sell it, nor can you export it. So that's a very, very big impact on the unitary side of things. And that kind of brings us back to Canada. So what is Canada doing? What are we proposing? This proposal is actually quite old. So much like the AIM Act in the United States, we have ODCHAR, the Canadian Ozone Depleting Substances and Halocarbon Alternative Regulations. I'm getting pretty good at that, actually. So again, that is what regulates what we can do here at home. This is the proposal, so this actually dates back to 2024. This is a very, very old document, but again, we were waiting for the US to make their move. And no different than some of you who have taken my course before, or if we've spoken privately, or if you were at ORAC Spring Forum last year, I mentioned that you can't have inconsistencies in legislation across one of the largest borders on the planet. You have to have some kind of legislative consistency. So again, when we came out with this, it was very well aligned with what the United States was doing. Right now, there is a chasm between what the US is doing and what we're doing, or what we've proposed. So again, that's why we're kind of waiting. It's very, very premature. That video you just watched from the Oval Office was on Thursday of last week, right? So the ink is still wet, right? The paint hasn't dried. We're waiting to see what the Canadian government's reaction is going to be. But I would safely speculate by the third or fourth quarter of this year, we're going to see an updated proposal in terms of what the Canadian government's going to do to align with the US, and ultimately when that will be in force. So for those of you holding on to 410, you're likely on borrowed time, especially on the HVAC side. Refrigeration, we're yet to see what's going to happen next. So that kind of brings us to the landscape. And I'll shout out, Zaki, where are you? There he is. Zaki, I appreciate Copeland providing this, this landscape. Some of you may have seen this, but a shout out to Copeland for it. We have some active legislation in refrigeration specifically right now in Canada. On the air conditioning side, kind of more or less a free-for-all. The restrictions that we're seeing are predicated on nothing more than what the US said they can or cannot make and export, and we got the sharp end of the stick. But in refrigeration, what we've done is we've said federally, across Canada, 2200 GWP or less for a rack system, or a CDU, a centralized distribution unit, right? If you're a standalone, 1400 GWP. That allows you to have 448 and 449, which fall right here under both of those thresholds. Now, Quebec was a lot more progressive, and it's provincially enforced, so it's not a federal mandate. But provincially, they said, well, if you are less than 50 kilowatt, and for those of you that prefer imperial, it's about 15 ton. If you're less than 50 kilowatt, 1500 GWP. But if you're more than 50 kilowatt, you have to be at 150. And two things happen as we start to move to the left of this chart. The first is we become very, very unfamiliar with what we're looking at, right? Anybody here worked with 455 or 457 or 466? None of us have. Most of us don't even carry it, right? And the second thing that you'll start to see is they start to turn pink. I know it's a little difficult to see in this lighting, but they become mildly flammable. And you can see this little race to the bottom here, right? But we start to lose a little bit of capacity in certain cases. We move into a 2L status. We lower pressures in some cases as we start to collect down here. Don't get me wrong, there's still a couple of A1s left. The problem is availability. Sometimes it's the performance, sometimes it's glide, but all of these things matter for our system's health and operation, especially if you're replacing a piece of equipment, because unlike in air conditioning, where you're told what gas you're putting in, it's a box. But in refrigeration, you're given a blank canvas, right? And now I can paint any picture I want. What kind of compressor, what brand of valving, what refrigerants are going to operate, what safety devices, you're able to name whatever you want on that system. So that brings us to performance. This is going to be hypercritical as we go through this transition, especially if you find yourself in segments where you do have that blank canvas to decide on which gas you would like to use, right? So this is a very interesting chart. Very few people have this, but it's extremely valuable because it gives you an insight into all the different refrigeration gases. By the way, apart from 404 and 448, pretty much every single one of these, actually no, it is every single one of these are an A2L. And we've only been focusing on two. As I said, there are dozens more. Everything on this chart is using 404 as a benchmark, right? That's the baseline. You look at 448, you'll start to see the variances. And anything in a green box is good, a yellow box is okay, and a red box is bad. It's pretty straightforward. But if we look here, say 448, we gained 5% capacity versus that of 404. We gained, 5% and 6% on compressor efficiency. Discharge, up 10%, not that great, and so on. But the three major gases that we're going to start to see, and we talked about this last year, the three major gases we're going to see in refrigeration are 455, 454A, and 454C. But it's important that we know exactly what those gases do, how they perform. And the reason being is, let's say I take 454C as the example and I lose 7%. Well, what if I'm on a 100-ton system? 100 tons isn't uncommon in the refrigeration field. I lose 7 ton. That's a fairly big number, and it's even more so on the low temp side. Well, what happens to my system when I replace it? What do I need to do to offset that D rate? More horsepower. And when I put more horsepower, what do I need in order to do that? Well, I need more electrical. So now I might have the wrong gauge of wire. I may not have the service from the street. You may go over a threshold for operating engineers or stationary engineers of a facility, all because you chose a gas. And that's why it's important that we know what they do, because now you can make a conscious decision for what's in the best interest of your customer, what keeps you within the confines of the Operating Engineers Act, and what makes sure that you can mitigate your costs or the capital investitures that your end user will need to make. And it puts you in a very competitive position as well. But let's continue on that 454C train. So we gain that 7% on efficiency. Discharge is up by 4%. Now you might go, well, discharge temperature puts thermal stress on the compressor, right? And I think I said to you last year, there's two reasons why we're all in business in this room, right? The first is you're all really, really good at what you do to keep that system running healthily. And the second is because you want that compressor to die day one after warranty expires, right? Thermal stress on a compressor is a big deal, right? So sometimes we have to give and take. So you might say, well, 4% is a lot. Well, we gained 10 on 448, and nobody talked about it. So again, don't let that A2L start to curve your enthusiasm and start to point out trivial little issues like this. Look at 455 though. I'm going to point your attention to the glide, 22-degree glide. For those of you unfamiliar with glide, it is the differentiation between bubble and dew point between two different compositions of a ratio in a refrigerant blend. They boil off and they condense at different pressures and different temperatures depending where they are in the system. But that has a dramatic effect on your efficiency of the equipment, and you're completely out of the game for fully flooded evaporators. You must have an azeotropic low glide or no glide refrigerant in order to do it. So when we see 22, you go, well, okay, yeah, I'm gonna have a less efficient system, but really what you're worried about is a term we're all familiar with, fractionation. You develop a leak. In 455, you have a 3% CO2 component, R744. Doesn't matter where that leak develops, which gas do you think is going to leak out first out of the blend? It's the CO2. Changes the composition ratio, and as a result, that gas is no longer viable for operation. Go ahead and tell your end user he lost 10 pounds and you have to change 200 as a result. It's a tough sell. So that's why we're only going to see 455 on things like two-door lowboys, upright reach-ins, condiment rails, things like that, because they're smaller, more critically charged systems. We're not going to see this on the rack systems, right? But 454A, on the other hand, have a close look at that. We gain 9% on capacity, we gain 6 on efficiency, discharge temp up by 11%. Well, that's only 1% over 448. And our glide is on par with 448. So when you consider the operational parameters, the technical aspects, 454A does appear to be the best. However, that said, the GWP here is 238. And the reason why that was in yellow is because before Thursday's announcement, it had to be under 150 GWP in the US for over 200 pounds. So it was kind of an iffy. But now that's going to be given all kinds of room to run, including its predecessors, 448 and 449. Very, very quickly, because that was the medium temp version. Low temp, same idea, but have a look now. We're starting to lose 6%, 14%, 23-degree glide. All of a sudden, your numbers shift. The moment you go into low temp, it exacerbates any of the capacity derates, efficiency derates, thermal stress increases, or glides. These are going to be critical factors, so please remain vigilant when you're selecting these new gases. We know a lot of your end users are the driver. Everybody wants to wave a big green environmental flag atop their building. We appreciate that. But the fact of the matter is, when you go ahead and quote that, and you're down 14% in capacity, and now what is a nominal 50 horse needs to go to a nominal 60 in order to make up that shortfall, your customer is then going to be having a budget discussion next, not an environmental one, right? So just make sure you're vigilant on that. Just to keep pace with time, I'll move on. Again, gone are the days of set it and forget it. We now have to consider some very serious risks that the code book demands of us. And we also have to consider the room area formulas that we need to understand to make sure that we have the right square footage, mechanical ventilation, or whatever else might be required in order to operate a 2L. And you may not be servicing an occupied space. You may have it in a mechanical room, right? And last year we talked about the 6 major points in the code book. And if you need a reminder later, come talk to me, and I have them in my head. I can tell you where to look for them. But you might have a classed mechanical room, right? You might have an industrial plant with robotics. This may not be an occupied space. And the occupancy classifications have different rules. So make sure you're vigilant on what application your equipment is servicing, and it'll give you a bit of an idea. But in all scenarios, we need to go through a little bit of a risk assessment, right? They have a low flammability, but they require some attention. So we know they're lower flammability gases, but they can form a flammable mixture under perfect conditions, right? The LFL, the lower flammability limit, that is the catalyst for everything. It is going to determine how much refrigerant you can put in your system by code. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, and believe me, it is being enforced. I have the astute privilege of having to deal with a lot of the inspectors in a number of different provinces around Canada for this very reason, and they are monitoring it. And as this starts to gain traction, we need to make sure that we're doing our part as a community to be within the good taste of the code book. So that LFL is going to be the critical factor for charge limit determinations. But again, leak dispersion and accumulation happens on the floor. And that's relevant because the formulas that we need to perform under the B5223, the 23 specifically, for those of you with the 18 edition, please recycle it. Because all the refrigerant is heavier than air, it accumulates on the surface. And as a result, we have to use an area formula versus a volume one, right? Using an area-based calculation incorporates that leak accumulation that would typically pool on the ground. And even if you have air distribution, we have diffusers all throughout this room, right? And unless you're sitting directly under one, you can't really feel it. Okay, because all of the formulas that the code book is looking at from a charge limit determination perspective is area, but from a leak mitigation perspective, it's all volume, right? And volume alone doesn't represent that risk well. If it were used, we're assuming even distribution. So if we develop a leak, that's assuming we have enough air velocity, enough turbulence in this room to lift it off the floor and mix it evenly throughout the space and dilute it below that risk threshold in parts per million. But it's not realistic. What is even though this is a very low flammability refrigerant, even in a small area with a small charge, it can create a major risk factor, right? A ceiling space, for an example, or an interstitial space above a ceiling somewhere, that's an example of that. A garage, underground parking garages is another. So you got to be really, really careful when you're putting that in. And again, occupancy by classification is going to determine what you're permitted to do, but just make sure you're exercising vigilance from a safety perspective. Again, the B5223 needs to be your new best friend. If you don't have it, I really encourage you, go purchase it. You can get it at the ANSI store or the CSA group. Again, very, very important you have it because you are going to need it as we start to get into A2Ls more and more and more. Again, they're using those area-based calculations to ensure you have proper mechanical ventilation, and each of those refrigerants has a different dispersion rate. And if you remember, when we were here last, we showed you a video of that leak in a room, and you saw how quickly it dispersed. You also saw a forced ignition. It was nothing to write home about, right? It wasn't that AI-generated rooftop that's engulfed in flames, and at the bottom it just says A2L, right? That's all crap. But when we're doing that formula, this is what it looks like. This is the actual formula. Now, granted, if you look in the code book, you won't see it in this form. You have to take bits and pieces, and you have to understand this. This is what's required by law if you put in any A2L system, period. Doesn't matter. Residential, commercial, industrial, mechanical, industrial area, or a mechanical room, doesn't matter. This is what it is. So very, very quickly, because I'm not going to put you to sleep, maximum releasable charge, here's what we need to consider. Total length of vapor, in other words, your suction line of interconnecting tubing, and you're going to multiply that by the length, and you're going to multiply that by the density of that vapor. You're then going to add that to your liquid. Again, volume, length, density. But that's not all. Over here, you've got the internal volume of the unit. For those of you running year-round operational systems, guess what happens? Your refrigerant migrates. It goes into the condenser, and as a result, we now have an internal volume and we have a mixed density. There's only two places in a system where we truly have mixed density: the condenser and the evaporator, or any heat exchange point. So that needs to be factored in. And each component you have will have the data in the IOM manual for that. So please make sure you're opening it. But this is what needs to be performed. The code book here uses 6.8 grams per second as a conservative leakage rate. That's what it considers. And the response time in which your safety devices have to react for a sequence of operation for safety shutdown, right? Be that closing solenoids and safety valves, be that activating alarms, be that disengaging compressor operation, whatever the case may be. And it's measured in milliseconds, but 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second, right? So again, this is that formula that we need to know. Thankfully, you're probably not going to need to perform that at all. I just wanted to scare the lights out of you. What I want you to do is to make sure you're opening up the manual. You know that thing called Installation Operation Manual? Most of our technicians kind of leave it on the dash of the truck or in the Ziploc bag of the unit. Open it, unless they want to perform that formula. This is an example. I won't mention any names, but this is an example of a manufacturer. Now, under UL requirements, they are forced to put these charts in the IOM. And we're going to give you an example. Let's take a 317M. We know that that evaporator, these are evaporators, by the way. We know that it has 3/8 and 7/8. Okay, great. 50-foot line run. We go down. We know we need 67 square foot minimum. It's that simple. Can anybody tell me why it's only the evaporator we're worried about? It's in the occupied space. Everything else is outside of it. So we really don't care. But these charts, and by the way, for those of you in residential, it's in the manual. Commercial, VRF, refrigeration, rack systems, it's all in there. And it's imperative that we read it. Even in equipment that isn't operating A2L, they have a mandate to put that in there. So make sure you're opening it up and consulting the charts. Very, very quickly, you're going to start to see some devices you've never seen before. You're going to see SSOVs, safety shutoff valves. They look like a solenoid. They are a solenoid, but they're not a liquid line solenoid. It's a safety valve, right? It will be in your liquid line, and 9 out of 10 manufacturers are putting a check valve in suction, all of which will be mounted on the exterior of whatever space you're servicing. To give you some kind of some close-ups of what that's going to look like, again, on your, I think my remote's dying here, on your liquid line, you're going to have that SSOV. That may require you to have 2 valves, an LLSV and an SSOV. You cannot use your safety device for pump down. Again, suction line, we want to make sure in case there's any buildup of pressure there, that doesn't make its way back into the space, and as a result, you're going to have a check valve there. Hot gas systems, 3-pipe, very, very popular. You're going to have one on your hot gas line on your 3rd pipe. You're going to have one on your liquid, and again, you're going to have a check valve on suction. When you have paralleled evaporators, again, same idea, very, very straightforward. But what if you have a reverse cycle? If you have a reverse cycle system, again, you're going to have a check valve on that loop, and then you're going to have your safety valves on your reverse cycle as well. So these are going to be components that the book requires you to have, dependent on how much refrigerant you've got in there, what application you're serving, and what classification by occupancy you have. So please make sure you're opening it up, but that's just a very, very quick glimpse at some of the devices you're going to start to see. And then you're going to see another one that most of you should be familiar with by now, and that's your leak detection devices. For those of you who haven't seen one yet, there's a photo of one. That's the Danfoss version. Very, very popular on a lot of the commercial equipment. I know that I'm not going to name any names, but I'm going to say that the big 5 all have these type of leak detectors on board. Starting on the refrigeration side, by the way, they come in different shapes and sizes. This is the Penn Johnson Sensata. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is going to be very, very popular on refrigeration equipment specifically. A few key highlights. They're going to be factory built in. You're going to see them in the side cabinets of the evaporators. If you happen to have a refrigerative air handler, it will be at the evaporator as well. Does anybody know why we put it on the sides and in the cabinet of the evaporator? It's where it's most susceptible to leaking. It's where the end loops are, right? Think about it. That's where 90% of your system's brazes are. It's on the end loops. You've got 2 sensors, again, one in each compartment, 15-year life expectancy. On the refrigeration side, you do have universal detectors now. 8 months ago, you had to get a specific one for that specific gas, but now you've got a tri-rated one for the 3 popular gases we talked about. And again, if the refrigerant is different and you find yourself in that situation where the sensor is not compatible with the gas that you're utilizing, please make sure it's changed out. Otherwise, it's not going to work very well, right? And again, it's important that we exercise vigilance and safety. On the air conditioning side, a couple of additional highlights. Again, they're going to be factory mounted by UL standards. Generic kits aren't allowed. Please tell your end user to stay off Amazon. It is not a good idea to put in a brand that's coming in from offshore and has no certifications, be it CSA, UL, ETL, or whomever else. They have to be listed with a proper safety agency. Under UL 60335-2-40, which we're going to talk about in detail, these are set to activate at 25% of LFL. So LFL, just as a reminder, is the minimum amount of refrigerant required in a space in order to be combustible, right? If you look at 454A, right, it's 13.3%. That means that by volume in this room needs to be 13.3% full of refrigerant to meet the minimum standard in order to combust. And then you need an ignition source on top of it. So we'll call it ultra safe. But these leak detectors are set to activate at 25% of that number. So whatever that works out to be, 3.9%, right? So they're set to activate and start a safety sequence of operation and shut down that unit until that disperses and the air parts per million gets down to safe levels, and then we reinitiate heartbeat operation. Again, they're not required in all applications. You might be below the LFL in terms of your zone. So you may have a very small charge in a very large area. A lot of people say, well, if we have a large area, we have a bigger system, we have a bigger charge. Not necessarily true. Marijuana grow operations, great example of that. We're only looking to temper the air. You have ductlesses everywhere, all of which are critically charged. You have a 10,000 square foot space being fed by 6, 8, 10 ton. And in a lot of cases, you're below all those thresholds, right? So sometimes an RDS isn't required, but you'd be hard pressed to find a factory that isn't installing them. Below 4 pounds. In HVAC, I'm going to stress that, in the HVAC sector, 4 pounds, it's actually 3.91, but 4 pounds is the threshold when you do not require an RDS, a refrigerant detection system. In refrigeration, it's 6.6. So it's very, very important to know that because there is a key differentiator there. And lastly, a constant airflow above a minimum CFM. In other words, I have a large charge, I have a large area, everything is status quo, but I have a very, very long duct run. And as a result, I have larger drives, I have way more CFM. Well, if you develop a leak at that evaporator, which is pretty much all we care about because everything else is external to the space, if I have so much air going over that coil, the air is diluting in short order, and it will never actually pose a threat. You'll never reach that LFL, right? Okay, so actually we're pretty much right on time. Last section is understanding UL. So again, we're starting to get calls now from a lot of you in this room, actually, I've talked to. They want to remove the 410 out of their existing system, and they want to put in an A2L. And if you haven't received that call yet, a call I do know you have received is, I have an air handler, and I have a condensing unit, and they've built the building around the air handler, and there's no way it's coming out, and there's sure as hell no way a new one's going in. And I need to change the condensing unit. The condensing unit's going to be A2L, but the air handler is 410. What do I do? Right? That's where understanding UL becomes very, very, very valuable to you. So let's establish what it is. The standard for heating and cooling equipment, UL 1995. Just as it sounds, it was originally published in 1990, but the final edition was released in 1995, right, which was the second edition. It was the pre-flammability era. All it focused on was electrical and mechanical protection. But we didn't have the same risk profiles as we did back then. We used 1222, 502 back in the early 90s, right? Maybe one or two others as 404 and 507 were starting to enter the market. But ultimately, it didn't cover very much. There was no detailed provisions for flammable gases. There was no leak detection requirements. And there was definitely no limit charge determinations. So what did we do? Well, we came up with supersedences, right? There's 3 major UL numbers that we use that covers our trade pretty much in its entirety. The first is 2-34. So all of them are 60335. 2-34. It governs the motors and the compressors, right? And we were, when we were at the CMPX show, Copeland was kind enough to put on a seminar for a full day where they went over this in detail. And you know, it's really, really valuable information when you understand it, because this puts you in the best position to answer either your own question or your customer's question. But all that said, 2-34, that's going to cover the motors. 2-40, that's your air conditioners. That's all your rooftops, your unitary products, residential, VRF, all of the HVAC side falls under 2-40. And again, it looks at your charge limits, your airflow, your ignition sources, your leak mitigation, your installation constraints. It looks at everything. But also as a part of that is what the manufacturer puts in their IOM. Like those charts, for example, in terms of how much square footage you need in order for an evaporator to operate safely. And the last one is 2-89, and it covers refrigeration. And because of the uniquity of it, it has to be separate because there's more components to consider as a result. Again, display cases, condensing units, self-contained, but the same thing as 2-40. Refrigerant limits, ventilation, leak mitigation, and system design. These are very important because they supersede 1995, and these weren't really written until 2021. And then there was another edition that came out in 2023. So the point being is, if you have an older system where they built that building around the air handler and it's certified UL 1995, which was basically everything 25, 30 years preceding that, it's not able to have any other refrigerant other than one of the legacy gases like 22 or 410 put in it, legally. Unless, of course, you want to get a UL inspector out there and have the entire thing recertified for tens of thousands of dollars. You're welcome to do that if you wish. But as a last slide, I want you to have a moment to just digest this, because this gives you the contrasts between the three. A couple of notable ones, right? Your flammability consideration, not addressed on 95. Your leak detection, not addressed. Ventilation triggers, not addressed. In other words, if your UL 1995 system, don't put another gas in. You're not allowed to do it. And if you do, you've now violated ETL for electrical safety, because now you have to put in electrical components like leak mitigation. You're going to have to put in safety devices, so now you violated CSA and UL because you've altered the piping diagram. And on top of that, if an inspector came out like ESA or TSSA, or any other province for that matter, you're now subject to being locked out. You've just violated every certification that that unit has because it doesn't fall under the new guidelines. And everybody, and there's a few manufacturers in this room, have gone through a great deal of trouble to make sure that you're working with safe, viable equipment that adheres to the code, which is my last point. If you open up the B52, it says in so many words, your unit shall conform to UL 60335-2-89 or 2-40, right? I'm going to be putting out and publishing a document just like this for ORAC and sharing it with them, and it's probably going to be in their newsletter, just because I want to make sure this is within your reach. I want to make sure it's available to you. It saves you the time, but we'll have a bit of an FAQ, and we'll partner with ORAC on it just to keep it neutral. But at the end of the day, this is very, very important, because you'll see on 2-40, a lot of these things are addressed. And again, based on charge and system type, based on certain scenarios, on 2-89 for refrigeration, it's green check marks down the grid, across the grid. So these are going to be things that you need to consider. So when you do get the phone call, hey, I have a system, I can't change one side because there's brick and mortar work or whatever, I can't alter the building to get it out, don't try to skirt the ruling. It's not permitted to do, right? It's going to be a pain in the ass to do, but at the end of the day, the last thing you need is an inspector to come out and say, I'm sorry, you've done this, fail. It's going to cost you a whole lot more money to correct, and your customer is going to suffer downtime as a result. That is 1 hour on the dot. Most of you know me. For those of you I haven't met, I look forward to meeting you later. I've always put my email and my telephone number up there just because if there is any technical questions, again, I'm not out to solicit anybody except Dino. But if you ever have any questions on this, please feel free to reach out. I'll happily answer them. And I've been very privileged for the last couple of years to sit on the B52 Refrigeration Code Committee, so little extra access to some of the authors of the book if you have any specific questions. With that, are there any questions? Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Kevin. That was fantastic.
Oh, you're a good man. Thank you, Glenn.
But I did have a question.
Sure.
Hopefully it's not a dumb one. We get asked, that was my... In case anybody can't hear me. That was my question. You answered it already. We get calls all the time. Can we add a condensing unit to this unit, add cooling or replace it? There are still suppliers that still have some stock of condensing units. But the question I want to ask you is, have you heard of any rumblings of a process for UL to site inspect like ESA might for upgrading electrical systems? so that you could potentially get someone to site and say, hey, replace those control boards with compliant control boards that don't have, the spark issues, like to upgrade existing indoor air handlers. I mean, they're cabinets that are not going to catch on fire. It's the motors and the ignition sources from the VFDs and et cetera.
Well, I'm glad you said it, Glenn, because at the end of the day, you're right. In short, you'd be left with nothing but the housing of the unit after you were done altering it, right? It is the motors, it is the distance from the surfaces from an ignition source, because sometimes you may have everything in compliance, but literally the motor is too close, because there is a distance requirement as well internal to that system. And Glenn, you of all people know, go ahead and try to contact UL and have them come out. No offense to them, they're great, they're a great organization, they keep us safe, but at the end of the day, as a contracting community, as a wholesale, as an OEM community, do we really, really want to be fighting that battle? So the answer is yes, there is a path, but you would effectively be overhauling that unit, save that of the paint, in order to make it happen. And ultimately at that point, you're probably into more cost than actually doing the brick and mortar work to change it out in its entirety. So I'd recommend against it, but there's a first for everything. So if any of you do that, please call me anyway, because I would absolutely love to hear from you. So, okay, with that, see you out there on the course. Let's go have lunch. Oh, where am I going?